Thanks so much to all my patrons. Join now to help support the channel and help pick the books I review on this channel. Link in the description. It is very weird that I have to make this video, but last month a YouTuber much bigger than myself made a video called Epic Fantasy is Dying that made a pretty bold claim that immediately shot off a ton of red flags for me. Not only is the title pretty obviously overly dramatic, but virtually every point in the video is pretty easily debunked. But the weird part is that since then to now, there are a handful of other YouTubers that have made virtually identical videos from the title down to the content. And if I didn't actually know these people, I would have said it was like AI-generated content. And from that, we have Reddit threads and Twitter posts and whole Facebook discussions devoted to the death of fantasy. And now, I could make a whole other video about how unoriginal most YouTubers are, and I often fall for the trap myself, although I try very hard not to. But nonetheless, I find this one particularly strange. It's like people wanted to watch this flawed argument, but then decided to just repeat the same information to the exact same audience, without really reflecting on if the original information was even making the correct conclusions. Now, I work in politics. I'm extremely used to people taking snippets of information and spitting up a whole essay based on an incorrect thesis. So let me unspin this argument and get to the truth of things in the form of my very first YouTube essay. That's not my kind of thing, but we're going to do this and we're not going to make any edits, so let's get right into it. Now, let's go over every single main point that was made in these variety of videos, and I watched them all, and I'm going to tell you why I find literally all of them incorrect. So, claim number one is debut authors are not getting multi-book epic fantasy deals. The reality, debut authors almost never get multi-book epic fantasy deals, and while that's true now, that was also true then. Think of the three most famous epic fantasy authors over the past couple decades. We got George R. R. Martin, who wrote 5 books before A Song of Ice and Fire. We've got Robert Jordan, who wrote 7 Conan the Barbarian books before he wrote Wheel of Time. And we've got Brandon Sanderson, who famously got rejected 13 times before he finally got Elantris published. And even that was a standalone. So why would an author with no trust from either the publisher or the audience get a long epic fantasy series deal? That doesn't make any sense, and it's not rested in any sort of reality. Claim number 2. Fantasy authors are being told to keep their word counts lower than they used to. The reality, though, is that epic fantasy does not have to be long. The entire Lord of the Rings trilogy is only about 1,000 pages. And we are also seeing major supply chain issues that are impacting the entire book industry. There's currently a huge paper shortage because of demand for wood pulp, which is rapidly increased. And this is largely due to the massive amount of cardboard being used for online shipping. And this dramatically increased during COVID when everybody was buying stuff online and they never got out of that habit. There are also still issues of fewer workers in factories and warehouses that pack and ship the books, on the shipping docks and the trucks that drive and transport the books, and all of this contributes to causing major delays at pretty much every single step of the book delivery process. This, of course, means that publishers are telling authors to keep their page count lower, but the supply chain issues of today are not the supply chain issues of tomorrow. This is a temporary issue, not the sign of epic fantasy dying. From diversifying supply chains to exploring new product lines, the printing industry is evolving to meet the demands of today's market, but they have not caught up yet. But they're working on it. Claim number 3. Traditional publishing moving away from long epic fantasy means epic fantasy is dying. But the reality is, self-publishing is currently killing it with epic fantasy, and every sign shows that it is on the increase, not the decline. You know, just because traditional publishing may be moving in one direction does not mean that the genre as a whole is. The Bound and the Broken, The Wandering Inn, Cradle, the Echo Saga, the list goes on and on and on. Claim number 4. Fantasy TV series are tanking because they are epic fantasies. The reality? Some epic fantasy TV series are tanking because they aren't very well made. Rings of Power was, to be as nice as I can, not good. The Wheel of Time has a lot of problems, but epic fantasy adaptations that do a good job are a success. Just look at the House of the Dragon that's been averaging 30 million viewers per week and winning Golden Globes. One of the First Law books is in the works to become a movie, and there is zero sign that TV and movie deals for epic fantasy stories are on the decline. If anything, we're getting more deals than we were a few years ago. Claim number 5. Publishing houses are not penning deals for longer series, like 5+ books anymore. The reality? As we've already covered, you do not have to be a long series to be epic. But further, and more importantly, publishing houses rarely ever penned long deals in the first place. They penned shorter contracts and went from there. The Wheel of Time, that ended up being 14 books. It's kind of well known as being like, the staple, really long series. But the original deal was only for 5 books, and Robert Jordan originally just planned for it to be a trilogy. A Song of Ice and Fire, that's going to supposedly be 7 books. It's 5 books now, but the plan is for 7 books. But the original deal was just for a trilogy. 𝗟𝗏𝐿 is 6 books, but that started as a trilogy. Malazan, Book of the Fallen, is a 10-book series. That was literally a 1-book deal that after that was kind of a big success, they went from there. Getting a deal for a long series right out of the gate is the exception to the rule. And all of these longer deals have the potential to get canceled if the first book tanks, so it doesn't really mean anything anyways. Claim number 6. Publishing houses are permanently moving away from epic fantasy. The reality, though? Genres wax and wane depending on what the smash hits are that then influence future books for years to come. Why did epic fantasy get a huge resurgence? Because of Game of Thrones becoming a smash hit. Why is romantasy getting a huge resurgence right now? Because Sarah J. Maas and Fourth Wing are smash hits. But further, traditional publishing is still pumping out amazing epic fantasy stories. Dandelion Dynasty, Empire of the Wolf, Mistborn, Stormlight Archive, Bloodsworn Saga, Immortals, Will of the Many, Empire of the Vampire, Ostenard. The list can go on and on and on. The most fantasy series did not explode in popularity and tell their ways into their series. And I guarantee you that there are relatively unknown epic fantasy stories being published right now that will be significantly more popular in the years to come. We just don't know what they are yet. Claim number 7. There is no money to be made in long epic fantasy series. The reality? Trilogies and standalones make the most amount of money for authors, and this has been that way for a really long time. And publishers, they don't make as much either, unless this author is mega famous, and then they get the long deals. And those shorter series can still be epic, like we've talked about a couple times now. The most famous epic fantasy story of all time is Lord of the Rings. It's a trilogy, and not a very long one at that. But thinking about recently, Battle Mage by Peter Flannery, Sword of Kagan by Emma Wang, these are most certainly epic fantasy stories, and those are standalones. And there are countless examples of standalones or trilogies or smaller type series that are epic fantasy in scope, but still getting penned today. Claim number 8. The rise of romantasy means the death of epic fantasy. And this is kind of the one that I feel most passionate about. But because the reality is romantasy is good for fantasy, not bad. Okay, first, much of romantasy is epic fantasy. Let's get that out of the way right now. I know a lot of people have this pretension around hating romantasy. I don't like romantasy either. I've read a couple of them. I did not like them. But let's be straight up here. A Court of Thorns and Roses, epic fantasy. Fourth Wing, epic fantasy. Crescent City, epic fantasy. And just because it also has romance in it does not make it outside of the scope of epic fantasy. It's epic fantasy with romance in it. Epic fantasy does not just mean sword and sorcery. That is what sword and sorcery is, or old school fantasy. But nearly all progression fantasy as well is epic fantasy, for example. The Wandering Inn, Cradle. These are obviously epic fantasy stories that are not traditionally thought of as epic fantasy. But even if we get beyond that and you're like, okay, look, even though I will accept that romantasy is epic fantasy, I don't like that, and I want just classic epic fantasy. But there are new readers to the fantasy genre, and many of them will fall in love with the non-romance aspects of the romance stories they're reading, and then transition into non-romance epic fantasy. There are tons of epic fantasy readers today that started out reading Twilight. Which brings me to another point that I have to bring up, in that romantasy being a dominant subgenre of fantasy is not new. And new branches of fantasy that become huge hits, like the YA craze of the 2000s with Harry Potter and Hunger Games, they are similarly good for the genre. Did they kill epic fantasy? No, they didn't. They helped contribute to the growth of epic fantasy. We should be happy and encouraging of these new branches, not judgmental. What I believe we're really seeing here is more women getting into speculative fiction, in part because more women are writing speculative fiction, which is absolutely amazing, and we should be embracing this. You know, the entire idea is based around this concept that there are the same amount of fantasy readers out there, and then when a new subgenre comes, that they're pulling away from the other genres. Now, they are partly right when they say this, that the amount of like the fantasy pie that is devoted to epic fantasy is shrinking. But the pie is getting larger, not smaller, which isn't contributing to less epic fantasy. It's just contributing to more fantasy in general. So, in conclusion, you can summarize this whole thing as, you know, the reports of the death of epic fantasy are greatly, greatly exaggerated. So, that's all I got. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to talk to you about this more, and let me know what you think. That's it for me, and as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to all my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier and Librarian tier patrons: Anna G, CJ, Doust, Darren, JD, Jonathan, Nathan T, Nev's Book Channel, 𝗓𝗏𝑥ia, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L, Sydney Baker, 𝗂𝐶, Tahir, Tommy Rose, Zion, Anna, Andra, Blair, Brock, Evan, Joe UK, Kat Mick, Michael Sugarman, Sky, Tyler, and 𝗏𝗏𝐸. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video, and if you want to watch some more content from my channel, click over here and I've got some good videos for you. Thanks so much.